Are you ADHD and sometimes struggle with planning because it's really hard to get visibility into all the overwhelming stuff that you need to focus on in your life? Me too. And that's why I developed this system that I'm going to show you today. It's a concept for how to think about planning and specifically about visibility into everything that you're doing, whether that's in your personal life or your professional life. This is especially for folks with ADHD, but honestly, anybody who struggles with this might benefit. If you're new here, hi, my name is Avery, and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. So this particular video is actually a system that I kind of like ad hoc came up with in my head when working with one of my clients, and I realized that it was actually pretty easy to put together into a video and show you how to use it, and so that's what we're doing today. This does not depend on having a whiteboard. This is not the only way to do it. I'm going to show you on this whiteboard, but this is more of a concept that you can use for planning, whether it's on a computer, whether you use a planner, whether you just have regular paper, however you like to do your planning. I may at some point actually do a video where I show this digitally, but for now we're just going to do it on a whiteboard because it's easy to show you. And we'll zoom in on this whiteboard in a second once we get into it. But first, let me just kind of tell you what we're talking about here. So something that I noticed is that when I'm thinking about planning, when I'm thinking about, what are all the things that I need to do in my life, it can be really chaotic, especially with an ADHD brain. And there can be really different kinds of things that I'm thinking about. So I'll just give you right off the top of my head, haven't planned this, but just an example of some of the kinds of things that I've been thinking about, whether they're already written down somewhere or just in my head, that are on my mind right now. So, it's everything from, I know that there's some cleaning that I need to do in my kitchen. I've been thinking a lot about neuroqueerness and theorizing neuroqueerness. Maybe that's going to be a book project, or maybe it's just a thing I'm thinking about. I'm trying to get better about my dental hygiene. I know that I need to do something about the fact that I've been struggling to notice notifications coming in, get on top of some of my social life. I'm also trying to find a part-time job. That's just 4 or 5 of the things that I've been thinking about. And I'm sure that if you do that kind of just brain dump of the things that you're thinking about, you're going to have a similar list where, when you try to understand what do I have to do, for a lot of people there's quite a lot of variation in scale. And that's the main thing that this is going to address, although there's some other stuff too. So one of the main things is the fact that we think about all these different scales. So in that list, I'm talking about some things that are huge areas of life type things. I'm thinking about some discrete projects. I'm thinking about some tiny little tasks. I'm thinking about some recurring habits. All of those things, if I just ask myself, what do I need to be doing? There's going to be all these different things. And for some folks, we try to figure out, organize our lives by thinking in different categories. So it's we might have an app that we use for habit tracking, and that's what we do for habits. And then we have project management. And then we have just a to-do list. We're thinking about these as discrete. For some folks, you try to dump it all in one place. Things that have dates might go on a calendar. But for some people, their calendar's in with all their other notes and things. I've noticed that when I work with folks around organization, time management, planning, that we all kind of have different ways of thinking about these things. And often we're not really distinguishing between big picture goals, areas of life, responsibility, habits we want to establish. They're kind of all over the place. And I think with ADHD brains, this is especially true because we have this ability, which is kind of cool, to navigate lots of different levels of context and to make lots of different associations. But one of the challenges to that is that sometimes, we think of one thing and then it spools out into a million things and we're kind of lost and can't figure out how to take the next step. In addition to thinking about these different scales, you might also have noticed some differences in the kinds of things that I listed. So there might be variation if you do a brain dump like that. And maybe you want to pause and actually try it to see if this is true. If you'd like, you can hit the pause and then come back. But you might notice that you have some variation in predictability. You know, there might be some things that you know are going to happen, or you know how they're going to happen, and other things that are a lot more nebulous and uncertain. You might have variation in terms of some things have like a discrete end, so they're a discrete project, they have an end date. Other things might be habits you want to establish that would be pretty much lifelong, or things that are really long-term and nebulous. There might be things that take place for a certain period of time. There might be things that take place when a particular outcome is achieved, when it's done, essentially. And there might be big areas of life that just continue to be an area of responsibility for you. You might also have variation getting into the nitty-gritty of like how much you're able to concentrate or chunk up the work. So with sometimes with an ADHD brain, it can be really helpful to batch work, to be able to kind of like do a lot of stuff in one session, but not all kinds of work are like this. You know, it might be that you have a limited amount of spoons at a time to work on certain kinds of things that require a lot of focus or a particular kind of focus. But there also are things like, you know, projects that involve a lot of back and forth, a lot of emails, a lot of communication, where you actually can't concentrate the work at all because you send one email and then you got to wait. Or it might be something like, let's say you're learning a language, right? You can't really, even if you could theoretically sit here and focus on language learning for 5 hours, that's not really how language learning works, right? It has to be kind of consistent from day to day to day. Language learning is a good example of, you know, a kind of to-do or task where you actually need to have some consistency in it, at least some degree of consistency, or you'll start to lose it. So, you know, there are certain kinds of things. Exercise might be another example of this, where you have diminishing returns, or you lose the progress you've made if you don't continue to do it, where you have to at least touch that thing in your life every so often. You can think of other things like that in maybe a lighter way, like, for example, relationships, right? It might not be that you have to talk to somebody every single day, but if you ignore your partner for months and months at a time, you might not have a partner anymore. So like the amount of consistency that's needed will vary. Other things, it's like I could either sit down and I could do it in 8 hours, or I could do it 10 minutes at a time and it wouldn't really matter. There might be a question. There's a little spider friend on my carpet. Go on, spider friend. Don't crawl on my computer. I like spiders. I'm a writer, and spiders are good storytelling allies, but we want to keep them away from our MacBooks. You might also have, you know, some variance in, like, do you have to depend on somebody? Is somebody else involved in different tasks? Or do you need access to a person? Do you need access to a particular resource, like a physical space or something that you share? Is there urgency or a deadline behind it? Is something we often do think about. And then, of course, like, another thing we often think about is just importance. Like, you know, how much do you care about this thing? Do you feel called to the thing? Do you like the thing? Do you want to do the thing? Do you need to do the thing, right? So there's all these different bits. So the idea of this tool is to give your brain some visibility and to kind of be able to take that scale problem of small things, big things, small things, big things, and be able to almost like equal everything out and see it at a similar level of detail, and to avoid having to overplan everything in advance. Because sometimes the way that we handle this difference of scale problem is we say, okay, everything is part of a project, and every project has to be planned out and has to have all the steps, and we have to have all the sequences and understand everything. And especially if, like me, you're autistic and ADHD, you might really like tend towards that and tend to want to plan everything out. But by the time you get to doing the thing, too much has changed, because things are uncertain and things do change. And so, you know, embracing that things naturally change is part of this model, where we're not going to actually like plan out everything in advance, but we're going to be more specific the sooner action is, right? So for things that we have to do soon, we're going to be more detailed, and things that are longer term, we're going to be less detailed, while still making sure that they show up somewhere. I recommend, as you're thinking through this, that part of what you're doing is not only planning like when you do things or take action, but also checking in on things that you might forget. So, you know, a lot of us have areas of our lives, we have responsibilities, we have goals that kind of take a back seat a lot because they don't feel as urgent or as important, but they do matter. And so we want to like build them in as we go and not like ignore those things. I will say that this works the best if you're open to some degree of long-term planning. Now, I'm going to give time frames that are totally not required. Like, I'm going to talk about this in terms of like quarters and months and weeks. You could do a shorter time frame. You could do different divisions of time. However you think about time is totally fine. This is not really dependent on that. It's more thinking about multiple periods of time, not necessarily what those are. That said, if your particular neurotype, your particular presentation of ADHD is such that you really can only think about like the next few days and you don't like to do any degree of long-term planning, this is maybe not right for you. It's also true, and this was something actually that I noticed, interestingly enough, like I came up with this with a client, and then we realized that for this client, it wasn't necessarily the right system, or it might not be the right system, because for this client, one thing that we figured out through coaching and through talking through it was that they were not actually responsible for things at the higher level that we're going to discuss. So for example, if you're in a job and there are particular goals that you're working towards, but you're not actually owning that goal, you're not responsible for that goal, you're not accountable for that goal, and if that goal just like fell by the wayside, it wouldn't be your fault, then maybe you don't need to have it as part of your system. That's somebody else's system. You can just feed into that system. So it's really, really up to you. I'm going to go through an example here of a professional context, and then depending on how we do on time, I may briefly talk you through for personal. But you could do this in any way you want. You could do it for your whole life. You could do it for your personal life, your professional life, for a small chunk of either of those things. But I'm going to be doing this at a level that is like digestible for you to look at. And I do think that it makes sense not to try to focus on like 20 different high level things at once, but to narrow it down to 4 or 5. So let's see what we're talking about here. I'm going to adjust the camera a little bit. Give me one sec while I get this situated. Okay, so this is a little grid I've set up. I'm going to pull my computer closer. Okay, so the starting point for this method is that we're thinking in terms of unequal stretches of time. So rather than doing something you might see like a frequent way of organizing information would be to say Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, right? And then maybe like subdivide into months or something. But we're not worrying about the whole year starting out. So this is an example that is an annual, or this is like an example of how you might plan out a year in a professional context. But even though we're thinking about a year, we're not planning the whole year. These are uneven. So this is some areas of focus for the whole year. Then we're going Q1. This says January, and this says week 1. I'll explain that in a second. But that's one thing just off the start is to keep in mind that we're talking at different levels of granularity. So the first column is our biggest picture thinking. I labeled this areas of focus. You could also think of this in a professional context. This might often be like your performance areas or goals if you have those. So a lot of folks have, on your like, if you work in an office environment where there's a kind of annual review and there are, 4 or 5 different like job duties or areas of responsibility that you have that you get quote unquote graded on in your performance review, then that might be what you're looking at here. If you're in a professional environment that's a little bit different, maybe it's just areas of focus. If you're doing your personal life, you could think of your sort of big areas of focus. This might be, social, this might be hobbies, whatever it is. You'll note that, like I said, only like a 4 or 5, if you're thinking about your whole life, there might be 9 or 10 areas of focus for the whole year. But I think so you could do it that way, but I think it's a little more digestible to kind of think of how can I cluster those or group those so that it's about 4 or 5. If you'd like, it could be 10. So this example is this is a job I've had before, so it was just an easy one to do as an example. So this is a hypothetical person who is managing a database. And so they're doing tech in whatever context, and they're managing a database. And they have these areas of focus. So these might be performance goals for the year. So one of them is support tickets. Maybe they have a performance goal. I've had this before. That's something like, maintain excellent, customer service on support tickets. But the thing to know about this is that we're talking about something that they have to do all year that is a consistent flow of or I shouldn't say consistent, I should actually say a variable flow of small tasks, little tickets, and they might be actually some might be bigger, some might be smaller. This is not a very predictable area because who knows what support tickets you're going to get. There might be some predictability, but it's going to be a bunch of little things coming in that they're having to do on maybe a daily or weekly basis very regularly. Then we have an area of focus that is overhaul an object on the database. And if you don't know tech vocabulary, we could just say overhaul a part of the database. So this is a discrete project where they're making a change in the database itself. And that's something that's an outcome. They're supposed to have that done, basically, at some point this year. They're supposed to overhaul this database, and that's something they'll be graded on. Then this is another kind of discrete project. It might be documenting their database. And they're supposed to write tech documentation for the database this year. And then the last one is project support. So maybe they have a performance goal that's something like, provide excellent support to other people's projects that need data from the database. Okay, that's another one that might be kind of unpredictable or just an area of responsibility where it's I don't know what people's projects are going to be throughout the year. And this is pretty common, I think, in a professional environment where you have some things that are kind of always happening and flowing in, throughout your time, and then you'll have discrete projects. That might be a goal for the whole year, but maybe the project takes 3 months, maybe it takes the whole year. They're just going to kind of vary. So these are, different sizes, but ultimately somebody's being evaluated in these areas. Now, this is probably not their whole job, right? There might be other things that don't fall in their performance evaluation, but these are the things because they're in their performance evaluation that their manager is, in theory, prioritizing. And so we want to pay attention to those. So you could think about your own context, your own job, or your own personal context. What are the big areas that are prioritized? So this is actually the point of prioritization. Whether you're doing this for the year or a smaller period of time, it's thinking about, what are the areas of focus that you realistically, how many can you realistically do? That's why I'm saying 4 or 5. How many can you realistically focus on? In this case, for a job, it's pretty common to have 4 to 6 big areas or performance goals for a year. More than that might be, either might be ridiculous or might just mean that they're not really areas of focus. They're small projects. And this is the point at which you may set things aside, right? If a manager was figuring out your what you could do over the year and they had 17 different areas, they probably have to decide what goes in there, what's important. So I think it's always important, and even at this level, it's good to have a later bin. I don't have that on the whiteboard here, but this might be, if you're doing this on a whiteboard, you might have a little notebook that serves as your later bin. So what I mean by a later bin, or you might call it a someday maybe list, if you're familiar with getting things done methodology, they call it someday maybe. A lot of apps use the term someday maybe, or you could call it a later bin. But basically, these are things for later. So starting at this level, you might put in a later bin, things that are areas of focus that are not going to be priorities over the period of time, in this case, over the year. There might be other projects this person might work on this year if they get to them, but they're not going to be the priorities. In your personal life, it might not be that you have literally every single area of things that you do. Maybe it's something that's taking a back seat right now. Maybe it's that you're probably going to do some learning this year, but learning is not an area of your life that you really want to focus on. And so maybe there's things around learning that would be later. Or maybe there's big projects that you're just at some point I want to learn Spanish, but it's not happening this year, so we'll put it in the later bin. The later bin, I think it's useful to, you might have a list like that where it's things for next year, things that are totally outside of this whiteboard, things that are beyond the scope of time you're talking about, and then to have a separate maybe page in your notebook, separate bit of your later bin that's more about things that do go on this whiteboard, but they're not for the period of time we're dealing with right now, because Because as I said, we're not looking at every single quarter in this example. We have Q1, January, week 1. Well, what do you do if it's in Q3? What do you do if it's in week 3 or whatever? So that's where it's nice to have a later bin, a spot to put things that are for later, not the time we're considering right now. But I'll get to that in a second. I'll talk about that in more detail, so don't worry about it right now. But later bin, have one in some form. You could also do, if this works better for you, you can do like a pile of index cards, like a box. So any way you want to organize a later bin. The point here is, what are my big areas of focus? And this is where you prioritize and decide what matters for this period of time. Okay, the next thing that I would recommend is that you sort of start to distribute across your second level, in this case quarters. If you're doing this just for a quarter, it might be months, but your second level of granularity. So in this example, we're thinking about distributing across quarters for each of these different goals. So we're asking ourselves, is this area of focus of this performance goal, is there actually something for it every single quarter? So you might be planning and you might say, well, this project doesn't start till Q2, so there's actually nothing for Q1. That's fine, right? There might be some things at your highest level that just aren't focuses. They don't have to be focuses throughout the big period of time, in this case, the year. But other things, they might have activity happening in them every quarter. This is a good time, thinking about distribution across the quarters, to kind of note if there are natural decision points, if there are like what I would call a do or die date. So if there is urgency, so this is where urgency does come in. So if I'm looking at each of these areas of focus, this is again not on the whiteboard because I only have Q1 here, but I might have in my later bin, or just, you could call it a separate page, right? Where you just very, very high level, we're not, again, not detail, we're not over planning everything, but just at a very high level, we're asking ourselves, what does the distribution of these things look like across the quarters? If you're looking at your life, what does the distribution of different areas of life look like? Are you focusing on one now, one later? So for example, support tickets, probably this person's going to have to do them all the time. So it's going to be every single quarter we would expect to have stuff there. So we know we've got to reserve some of our time every single quarter for support tickets. When we look at overhauling an object, that, we could ask ourselves, how big a goal is that? Is that an area of focus that needs the whole year? Maybe it's only like a 3-month thing and it goes in one quarter. Great. Okay. It goes in a quarter. We don't necessarily know yet which quarter, but we might start to think, okay, that's a discrete project. That's also a discrete project, documentation. And this is where we can ask ourselves questions like I was talking about at the top. So is this something that can get like all chunked together, or does it need to be spread out? Maybe overhauling an object involves a lot of back and forth conversations with people. So even though you could theoretically do it yourself in like 2 months, there's a lot of stakeholders and it's actually going to take more time. Maybe documentation is something I could literally just sit down and write. But it also could be something where I don't have to sit down and write it. I could do it, kind of gap fill. I could do documentation when other stuff isn't happening. And so this is when I start to think of the interplay between them. If support tickets go up a lot at a particular time, I may not be able to work on documentation. So I can make an estimate. Of course, at this point, it's just an estimate. It's just a guess. Project support is another example where it's like, I don't know, how many projects am I going to be asked to support? Maybe I have an idea, maybe I don't have an idea. So you're just making a best guess, but I think on a separate page it's useful to make a note of what you expect. Maybe make a note of, what is your goal of balance across these? So this is going to depend on the workplace, right? Some workplaces might say, a manager might say, I want you working on a little of each of these all the time. And so you would say, great, well, I can only, allocate, what's a quarter? 25%. To each of these. Or it might be that somebody says, no, I really want you to always prioritize this area first. So this is another thing where when you're thinking about these, you're not only saying these are the ones that count, but you're saying like how important are they relative to each other. So for this person, it may be that support tickets, you have to do them. There's no getting out of them. They must happen. And it doesn't matter if you get a bazillion of them, you're going to have to do them all and nothing else is going to matter. So that might be like, this is first priority. And then maybe project support, because it's also like helping someone else. maybe this is also like pretty high priority, but you're allowed to set a boundary here. And you can say like, I actually can only support X amount of projects because these two things are also important. So this is where you work with your manager if it's in a professional situation to kind of figure out like the balance. If it's your personal life, obviously you make decisions yourself. But you want to think about things that, again, like if there's something like a habit, that's often going to be, it's not so much that it's necessarily the highest priority, but if it's something like a habit where if you stop working on it, it dies, then you probably always need to allocate time to it. So it actually does become kind of the first thing you think about, even if it's not necessarily the very highest priority. Whereas other things that are easier to kind of do whenever, they're gonna go a little lower often. And then I mentioned like something that's like a quote unquote do or die. So like maybe there is a reason why for one of these projects, let's say for this overhauling an object, that if you don't do it by like Q3, that there's no point. Maybe a better example coming out of this for a second would be something like, let's say there's a conference coming up and part of your job is conference speaking. And there's like a really big presentation or a really big, presentation that you want to do that's so big that it would actually count as like a performance goal, right? Area of focus. But if you miss the deadline to apply to that conference, then it's done, right? It's a do or die. It's like you either do it or it's not there anymore. And so something like that, when you're looking at each quarter, you want to make a note. Like, I have to apply by Q1 or else it's not happening in Q3. That would be an example where you would write down, make a decision or do the first step or whatever it is that has to be done by that deadline. Sometimes it's just make a choice. Am I doing it? Am I not doing it? That's a good thing to know. So you would have a page in your notebook or what have you, or on your computer, that's just high level each quarter. What do you expect to happen on each of these things? And it might include things like making a decision, finding out from somebody else what's going on. So like project support, it might be, each quarter, at the beginning of the quarter, I should find out what projects are requested. If they're not requested by the beginning of the quarter, I'm going to ignore them. That would be an example. It might be that you often, you might not know as much stuff about Q4 as you do about Q1. And so as you're distributing, you often, with a sooner period of time, you're going to be like, oh, I've prioritized this already for Q1. And so let's go ahead and start writing here. So this is where we turn to the whiteboard. And now we're looking at Q1. So if you wanted to, when you're distributing across quarters, you could go ahead and start to write on Q1 and then jot out the rest on a piece of paper. So for this person in Q1, they're going to have to do whatever support tickets come in. So their goal here might be something like, and having a goal, big picture goal for that quarter is a good idea at this level. So, goal might be, let's say, 80% response by due date. So it might be something like an SLA. If you work in tech, you often have what's called a service level agreement, which is, a specific commitment on how many tickets you're going to get done on time. Overhaul an object. So it might be that at the beginning of the year, we're doing our planning and we know that we're going to do this, but we're not ready to do this yet, right? So Q1, there might be nothing. It might just be a boop, nothing's here. But for this example, let's say that Q1 goal is to, assemble a project team. So by the end of Q1, I'm going to know who's working on this. Maybe on my separate piece of paper, it says my Q2 goal is to launch the project. My Q3 goal is to finish the project, for example. Okay, and then documentation, maybe it's, for documentation, okay, so this is like showing you kind of different ways of thinking about goals. So like here, it's how much am I going to respond to? Here, it's like I want to get to a particular milestone. Maybe here, it's I want to, document 3 objects in my database. So this is like a volume. The percentage is the volume, this is a step. Project support, I might not know what's coming down the pike on this one, right? So this might be like a little more of a question mark. And so I might say that my goal is to, respond and decide. So any request I get, I'm going to at least respond to them and I'm going to decide what to do next. This is a very vague goal. That's okay, right? So some of them might be a very vague goal. But we're going to start with this quarter. So again, it might be a specific outcome that you want by the end of the quarter. It might be a decision needs to be made. It might be a volume of something that's going to be done. It might be, so something like a habit. It might be the goal is actually that every week this quarter I do X, or every month I do X, or every day I do X. Okay, now you're probably starting to get the idea here, right? So now we're going to go to month and then we're going to go to week. So I like continuing to think of it in terms of a goal or an intention at the level of a month. If you're doing this on a smaller, more condensed time scale, this might, you might not need as many tiers, or you might start to think about actions a little earlier. But since I'm doing a whole month, I'm going to say, like, what is my goal for the month? So this might start to get more granular, but for some of these categories, for example, this one, well, it's probably the same, right? So this is actually just like 80% response. It's just the same. My goal is to do the thing I already said I was going to do. Whereas here, January, do I need to do anything on assembling a project team? Like, do I have any goals? It might be that actually I don't. My goals start in February. So this is a good example where I'm going to go to that later bin and I'm going to say, okay, I said nothing here, but I don't want to forget that in February, I need to start emailing some people. So I'm just going to make a quick note in my later bin. And so again, like, your later bin could be divided up. It could be something where you actually have a page for like specific months, specific weeks, or you could just have a big Q1 page, just like everything in Q1, and you just make a little note. It's like, February, do this. So once we get to February, we put it in. But again, we don't want to try to anticipate everything that happens in the future. We just want to put just enough in our later bin that we won't forget about it. So just enough to say, what is the very next thing that needs to happen? So this is really based on the concept of like the next action that comes from getting things done. There is no next action for January. So the next action is in February. So that's why it needs to go on the later bin, because there's nothing on this board. If there was already an action here, and then there was a clear next step, I wouldn't need to put anything in the later bin, because when I got to February, I would know what comes after what comes after the January step. The reason why I'm writing something in the later bin for this example is because I'm just going to see a blank space, and I'm not going to know what comes next. So we're just thinking about what goes next. If what goes next isn't happening on this board, we would scribble it in the later bin. The other time we might scribble something in the later bin, even if there was something written here, is if we had a really clear deadline. Like, by the 15th of February, something has to happen, I would scribble that down. Okay, and then documentation. So there's nothing happening here. That might mean I have some time. So like, this is where I start to think, and maybe even at this level, I start to think how they balance. So like, if I'm not doing anything here, then maybe I'm going to have time, and maybe actually, if I know I'm doing something in February, I'm not going to have time. So it might be actually like document 2 objects at the very beginning of the quarter, and then maybe it's nothing in February, and maybe it's 1 in March. So you're kind of like starting to think about what that looks like. But I'm not going to write down 1 in March, because I don't actually know what the world looks like at the end of January. So again, like, there's nothing here beyond January, because it may be that I don't complete this. And if I don't complete this, it's okay. Like, we want to be able to pivot and adapt and change, especially if we have ADHD, if this doesn't happen, and keep adjusting as we go. And so then project support, like, what do I know is happening in January? I mean, I don't know yet, really. So like, again, this might be the same. It's like, if anything comes up in January, I'm going to respond to it, and I'm going to make a decision, but I don't know about anything yet. So it's kind of a question mark. When I'm thinking about time, there's a lot of question marks here. But then when I get down into the most granular, in this case it's this week, again, you could do this at a smaller level where this was like month, week, day. For here, I'm just doing week. This is where I'm talking about actions. So now I'm starting to get really granular and say, what do I have to do? And generally, when you get to the things that are really close, you're going to have more information about them. And there's going to be things you just can't do if you don't have the information about them. So like, for example, support tickets, if we don't do support tickets that are really last minute, then we might know what most of our work is already at the beginning of the week. Project support, if somebody needs a project and they don't tell me until this week, nothing's going to happen, right? So at this point, I know that there's nothing going on in week 1 because I'm not going to respond within a week. So that's fine. There's nothing there. Great. Well, I know I've got time to work on these 3 things. I might, let's say we allow for a response like within 72 hours. So it might be that like if something came in Tuesday, I'd have to do it by Friday. So there's some uncertainty about the number of support tickets, but I might already know at the beginning of the week that I've got A, B, C. So now I'm starting to put down the actions. These are like specific tickets I know I have to focus on. And now I'm going to probably have a decent idea of how much time they're going to take. So some of the things that you consider actions, they might be work blocks in your schedule. It might be like, this takes 2 hours. I've scheduled a meeting on Wednesday at 9 a.m. And this is like 6 hours, right? So, it might be that you have, here you're starting to put things into your calendar. You're starting to have specific things like meetings. You're starting to have specific things like a work block where you know that you need X amount of time. So maybe you put that in your calendar. It's really good for ADHD folks usually, where you can, to like put in a work block and to attach a specific goal to it. I put this in 2-hour work block. I find 2 hours and I say, I'm working on thing A. That is all I'm doing. It's really specific. You know exactly what you're working on and what your goal is for that work block. Maybe you start working on it. It actually takes 3 hours. That's okay. You're just going to adjust as you go. But you kind of have an idea of where you're starting. All right, we already said that there's nothing happening here, which means there's nothing happening here either. Well, great, well, there's nothing happening here, and this is what I know about. So maybe I'm like, I actually have a fair amount of time this week. Great, I'm going to start working on this. So I could say I'm going to document one object, but I want to try to think about actions. If I have ADHD, I always want to try to think about actions in kind of small, digestible steps. So it might be, actually my actions are document, field list. So maybe this is all like document an object, but what are the steps? Document the field list, video, lesson, whatever it is, right? Whatever the pieces are of that thing. So maybe if you work in journalism, it might be interview sources, brainstorm article, write first draft. If you have your own business, it might be make 5 phone calls. It might be, compare some different tech you're considering buying. You're going to look at these 3 things. So you want to try to make it as specific as possible at this level so that you have an idea of time, so that you have an idea of what the action is, and so that you're not spending a lot of extra time kind of staring at it going, I don't know what that really means. So one area where ADHD folks can tend to get a little lost is that we need to consider everything in action that is in action. So what I mean by that is like, instead of writing down, I have to do a blog post, if doing a blog post actually includes doing some research, doing some writing, doing some scheduling of the post, separating those things out can be really helpful. If you can't actually get started on something until you make a phone call, until you Google something, it can be useful to like note that. So this is really like we're thinking about the next actions. What is the next thing that I need to do? And so sometimes it might be literally one thing goes in this box. I'm only going to do one next action. It might be you don't actually know everything for the week yet. So it might be that you have thing 1, and thing 1 is going to inform thing 2. That's okay too. You can put in your next action, and then when you finish your next action, you can go, boop, did it, okay, new action. If you're thinking about time, you might want to reserve, you might want to make a note. Next action is this, but I want to have 5 hours reserved for whatever comes after that this week. You might have things on here as well where it's like, okay, this is a work block. This is a specific time. This is a work block. It might be that this stuff that on the documentation project is what I would call a gap filler. So in other words, I'm going to start working on this stuff first, and then if I have time, that goes in. If I don't have time, it's okay. There might be some things where you're like, I know that my focus, I need to just sit down and work on it all together. And if I break it up, it's actually going to hurt me. So I'm going to make sure that I put a work block in my calendar. It's a good time to put a work block in your calendar for things that you tend to have trouble getting started as well. So I like to like batch, for example, writing or recording videos, because I find that like once I get going, once I start, my ADHD brain is like just fine and can keep going for a while. But starting is actually the hardest part, and it takes me 30 minutes to just get into the flow. So if that's true for you, getting into a kind of flow state might be easier if you have work blocks rather than splitting it all up. But then there might be other types of activities, like maybe it's writing emails or making phone calls, that you can do in little tiny chunks. And so those become gap fillers, where we start here and then we just fill in the gaps. Now keep in mind that if you're doing something like this, especially if you're doing something like this, like for work or for structured time, like a work day, that you don't want to be booked to 100% ever. So once we get to this point and we're thinking in terms of maybe we work 40 hours a week, we don't want 40 hours to be full. We always want to assume things take longer than we think they're going to take, and we also want to always allow for overhead. And so, there's kind of different ways you can think about overhead. You can think about a general amount of overhead, something like, I never book this to more than 80% or more than 60%, and not worry about what the overhead is. You might have things that you don't really want to write down. So like, it may be that in a support environment where you have tickets, you're not actually going to write down like this, because a lot of your tickets are going to take 5 minutes. But what you are going to note is like, reserve 6 hours a week for tickets. Always hold that time open. 6 hours a week. I don't have to write down what they are. I just know that I sit down and I look at my queue and I go through the tickets one by one, and I do that for 6 hours. So it's something like that where you just sit down and you do it, and it's pretty clear what you have to do, and you know where to go, and you can just write down 6 hours. That might be more like an overhead kind of thing. Like checking email is a good example of that. You're probably not going to write down every email you need to respond to, but you're going to think of that as overhead. You don't necessarily need overhead on the board, but if you want to, you could add an overhead category, and that's a good place where you can just like note things that you might not always remember to do, that are kind of smaller and don't go into areas of focus. Things like check Slack, check email in a work capacity, staff meetings, whatever. If it's useful to have them in front of you so that you know to do them every week. If it's your personal time, right, that might be things like, I'm trying to improve my dental hygiene. I don't think brushing my teeth is an area of focus. Brushing my teeth is a thing I need to do every day. So I'm considering that as like a thing that needs to happen. You want to be careful here. Like, you do want to, I guess, think about your boundaries. It's very easy with ADHD to like throw everything in the miscellaneous overhead bin. But you generally want to try whenever possible not to do that. And if you find, like in a work capacity, let's say that if these are all your performance areas and 40% of your time is doing stuff that has nothing to do with your goals you're evaluated on, that's a good time to talk to your manager and say, it's a problem. And I think it's really easy sometimes, because we can be people pleasers, to like do a bunch of other stuff. I had this happen once where I almost got fired because I was doing all this other stuff that wasn't on this list, and it didn't occur to me that they wouldn't care, because this is what matters. So this is in a professional environment, it's good to align with your manager, and if you're having a whole lot of stuff in the overhead bin, then that's probably something to talk about. If it's your own life, then that's just like a time to say, is there an area of focus that I did not write down that really should be here, that is really happening? Or are there things that are coming in that I don't really need to be working on or don't want to be working on? Or maybe it's that actually I'm doing a bunch of stuff that isn't on here, but it's for joy. And I didn't put joy as an area of focus, but I'm realizing that I need joy in my life. So actually that's a real area of focus, or that's a real overhead category that I need to prioritize to be a happy, healthy person. It's just a way of thinking about overhead. So like I said, like you can kind of think of as you're going, you can do them in a priority order if you have them. So like here, I'm putting support tickets first, and then I'm saying how much time do I have left. If I did 8-9 hours, okay, great. Well, I've just taken up 9 hours of my 40, so I know I've got 40 minus 9, and then minus whatever overhead, and that's what I have to allocate to the rest of this. That's one way you might think of it. If the goal is more balanced, like each of these is about even, then I would just divide my time, and I would say 40 minus overhead, let's say that puts us at 30, okay, divided by 4, that's what, 7.5 hours per thing. So what's a 7.5 hour chunk? Again, things always take longer, so it actually say what's about 5 hours, what's about 4 hours of work per area. It can also be useful if something requires consistency to fill it in first. So let's say, and I don't think I'm going to do a separate example, we've taken a lot of time here, but let's say I was doing this personally, and one of the areas that I had here was language learning. And I know that if I let the language learning go, it's going to very quickly slip off. So I'm actually going to, every time I do this, I'm going to go ahead and say, Spanish, maybe my goal is X amount of time per week. So when I go to week, I'm going to be like, every week, it's 2 hours of Spanish. It's the first thing I put down there. Or you might have a goal that's more like covering a particular amount of something. So maybe there's a course that you signed up for that you have access to for 3 months. And so you know that it's X number of modules divided by 3 months. That means every week I need to be doing one module of this course, or else I'm not going to finish it while I have access to it. So that goes in there. However, it makes more sense for the specific thing. It's also a good chance to check on other people's availability. And so when you're going through this, right, I'm doing all this at once. So this would be like January 1, I went through and did all this on January 1. Now, as I'm going through the week and I'm doing things, I'm like checking them off. Did it. And then maybe I get to the end of the week and I haven't finished these. Okay, that's fine. Now it's week 2. So I would erase this. I would say week 2. And then I would say, okay, these I finished, but these I didn't. So it's really easy to just say, okay, well, those are still there. So now what do I add? And so now I'm looking at this goal again and I'm saying, what do I add? And maybe as I go, I'm like, oh, that January goal is not gonna work. So it's just 1, right? So I can update as I go and say, that's not really right. And then I get to the end of January and now this is February. So you can see, and then this becomes Q2. So like you keep going every week, every month, every quarter, you would replace. And you're always checking back to the goal to say, how am I on the goal, and do I need to change the goal, and how am I on that goal, and do I need to change the goal? And so you have a little bit of like time to, in a professional environment, to go back to your boss and say, just so you know, we're not anywhere near that, so we need to like think about that. So that's one thing. And then when you're thinking about needing other people, well, this is where it's when you get to, let's say, the end of week 1, and you look here and you go, ooh, there's a phone call I want to make, right? Well, now I'm scheduling that. Or you're getting towards the end of January and you notice that there was something you needed to do in February. Okay, now I'm checking on availability. Hey, are you available in February for this meeting? If so, then it goes on the goal. If not, it does not go on the goal. So at the beginning of each period, of week, month, quarter, or however you're thinking of it, it's a good time where you can check in with people who might be needed to make sure they're actually available. That's also why you want to include things like respond and decide, or make a choice on the future, because that will influence as you're going forward. So you've got this bin as well, the later bin. And so this is where, as you're going, you're always going to check your later bin whenever you update one of these columns. So when I change this to week 2, I'm going to look at my later bin and make sure there was nothing that I had put down that I'd said must happen next week. When I get to the end of the month and I'm replacing this for February, I'm going to look and I'm going to see that I made a note. Aha, that was something I wanted to do in February there. So I'm going to put that down. So I'm going to keep checking my later bin whenever it's the top of a particular period of time. again, not necessarily anticipating every step. So, you know, it might be that I finished all of this. There's nothing in my later bin on this. So I'm like, okay, I finished that. Well, what comes next? So now we're always asking, what's the next action? What's the next action? You know, to achieve this goal, what's the action for week 2 that needs to happen? If this already happened, what comes next? If I don't have space for this, that's fine. Nothing happens this week, but let's jot something in the later bin so I remember when I get back to it. That's how the later bin kind of works in conjunction with the board itself, is that you're keeping in mind, you know, what would naturally come next. What's the next action, next action, next action? And you can kind of intuitively get a sense of, even though you don't have a full list of everything you need to do to get to here, you know, like let's say assemble a project team, even though you don't have everything you need, you might know that if you get to week 3 of March and you have 7 emails where people are like, I'm not sure I can be on your project team, this is a jeopardy. So you can kind of intuitively get a sense of how you're going. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it, how I think about this. If you want a personal example, let me know. This has been really long, but if you want me to do another video, I could totally do one with a personal example. I could do one with a digital example of how I do this digitally. I might even do a Notion template, either. Yeah, I might do a Notion template as well, if anybody wants it. But that's the little planning philosophy I have. So just to wrap up, just a reminder, not planning out everything in advance. Thinking with the most granularity about the period of time that's coming up, that's short. The bigger the period of time, the more we're talking about goals rather than actions, and we're talking about kind of big picture rather than small picture. As we go, if we're not able to do things, that's okay. We just keep an eye on our kind of progress towards the goal, and we might need to update the goals as we go so we can communicate back with people who are depending on those goals. And as we go, we get a sense of whether our areas of focus were really accurate, whether there's things that we need to change, how we're doing. The more you do something like this, the better you get at estimating your time and, you know, knowing what's realistic for you. And whatever that is, that's okay, because we're all human beings. All right, that's about it from me. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about this system, or if you try it out, or if you use a similar system that you like, that you'd recommend to folks. And we'll see you in the next video.